Today we're going to talk all about why you should expose for the highlights, exactly how you do it, what the benefit is, and how you actually get the end result you want by doing that. We're looking at landscape photography predominantly, but also we're going to dive into Lightroom. We're going to look at exactly how you get to that end result, all kinds of stuff. It's Tutorial Tuesday. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where every single week, every single Tuesday, you get a brand new, fresh photography tutorial. Now this week, we're talking all about why you should expose for the highlights, how to do it, and how it helps you get the end result that you want. Now when you're taking a photo, and this is generally applicable mostly to things like landscape photography, where maybe you've got a bright sky, and then you've got foreground and shadow, or something like that, somewhere where you've got quite a wide dynamic range across the photo. I probably wouldn't use this technique so much in portrait photography, or something like that. I'd probably use it more for landscape, cityscape, stuff like that. But by exposing for the highlights specifically, you're allowing yourself the most room, really, to play around with the highlights and the shadows and the exposure in the edit. Now, the main kind of concept here is that it's much easier to recover information from the shadows than it is from the highlights. You're going to very quickly run out of information once you kind of push the highlights past a certain point, whereas the shadows, you can retrieve information from those even when they're right down into the blacks, really. You can really get some information out and you can bring them back. So essentially that's the key concept here, is that recovering the shadows is just a lot easier when you're editing than recovering the highlights. So I've got this photo right here in Lightroom. Now you might have seen this particular setting before. It's one of my favorite spots to actually take a photo because it's just very picturesque. It's just a very beautiful location. But as you can see, the exposure is a little bit not exactly what you want. We've got a very bright sky, and then because of the way things are positioned, the way the sun is able to actually light things, the trees, the foreground is all kind of in shadow. And the way that I've exposed for it, I have leaned heavily towards exposing for the highlights. If you look up here in the top right of Lightroom, where you can see the histogram, you can see everything is pretty much pushed right towards the left. So a lot of this is right in darkness. And if you look at things like this tree, if I just zoom in here, you know, you can see a little bit of detail there, but it is very dark. And that might seem like it's not ideal. That might seem like it's not, not going to be a great photo. And it might be very easy to overlook something like this and just move past and kind of, if you're going through your photos when you get back from a shoot, just kind of bin this one because it's just obviously not the one. But I did this very deliberately. I exposed in this way very much on purpose because it's going to allow me to capture the exact image that I want to get. The camera in one single shot like this is not going to be able to capture the dynamic range across this photo that I see when I'm there, which is the nice blue sky and then the nicely exposed trees with the highlights and the water and everything. That's just not realistic. I'm going to have to expose something like this in order to then be able to go back and recover details from the shadows and things like that myself to be able to actually get the final image that I want to get. So let's talk about practically how you can do that before we dive in and I show you exactly how you can pull that information back. So when you're in a situation like this, if you allow your camera any kind of auto setting, it's probably going to overexpose because it's probably going to push the exposure up a little bit too much just to bring those darker areas up a little bit. Realistically, you're probably going to want to go into manual exposure for this, and that even means something like auto ISO. So I do use auto ISO quite a bit if I'm taking photos of portrait photography or something like that, because it's just very easy. If the light changes a little bit, it's just going to adjust it for me. I don't even have to think about it. However, in a situation like this, I want to control everything myself because I want to be in full control of the exact exposure because I know exactly what I'm going for as an end result. So if we look at the settings here, actually, we've got F11 so that I've got a nice deep depth of field. So it should have stretched right across everything in focus. We've got 160th of a second shutter speed, and then the ISO is just 200. So really quite low. And that's allowed me to get the sky, you can see the blue there. It does start to get a little bit white out towards the side there, which is out towards where the sun is over on the right. And just down a little bit, it starts to go up a little bit in exposure, which is something we don't want. However, the way that I've captured it means we're going to be able to get that detail back from the sky with absolutely no problems. So let's talk about exactly how to achieve an exposure like this, where you are exposing for the highlights. So you're going to set your camera so you're looking at the live view or maybe through the EVF, and you can actually see the exposure if you've actually got the kind of preview on there. And you're going to want to set your aperture, your shutter speed, your ISO in such a way that the highlights are properly exposed. So in this photo, it's the sky. You want to have that so it's not blown out at all. You want to have the blue in the sky visible in the photo, and you don't want to worry if something like these trees and stuff go into darkness, you know, really start to go into almost just black and you can't see anything. Don't worry too much about that. It's more important to get those highlights correct. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll expose for the highlights, so the highlights are perfectly exposed. So I've got a great sky and everything else is dark. And then I'll just push the exposure up a little bit, whether that's by lowering the shutter speed, so actually getting that a little bit slower, whether that's by boosting the ISO just a tiny bit, just because I know I can get some detail back from those highlights. I know I can bring something back, and you can see that's a little bit what I've done here. You've got the blue in the sky, but I've just pushed it up a little bit because I want to capture the perfect point where I can get all of the detail back from the highlights and the shadows and create the photo that I saw when I'm there and that I want to have. So I'm gonna set my exposure perfectly for the highlights, push it up just a touch, so something like half a stop, nothing major at all, something like half a stop. That's just going to capture a little bit more detail in the shadows, and we're not really going to lose anything in the highlights, because even if it starts to go into kind of white and almost on the edge of being blown out in the raw photo, as long as you are shooting in raw, you're going to be able to pull that back in post. So let's dive back in here. So we've got this photo where I've got these really shadowed trees and I've got this sky. So let's begin by bringing the highlights down a little bit, and you can see instantly when I do that, we get that blue back in the sky. That's a big thing. That's something I didn't want to lose, because once that's gone, you just have a white sky, and that's very, very boring and very dull. And it can ruin a photo. It can completely ruin a photo. So I definitely wanted to avoid that. Next, we can just boost these shadows quite a bit. And you can see if I boost those all the way up to plus 100, what a massive, massive difference that has made. Let's just look at the before and after. So this is before and this is after. Just with those two sliders, we have made a huge, huge difference to this photo. Now, we could always bring the actual exposure up a little bit and then just bring the highlights down again. We've allowed ourselves this room to kind of play around with what we want to do. So we can now bring the exposure up, which essentially is very similar to just raising the ISO when you're taking the photo. But because we're doing it in post, we've kind of got all this room to play around. We can bring that back. It's not baked in. The actual settings aren't baked in like they would have been if we'd brought the ISO up when we were there. I mean, if you have a look at just this without touching anything else, this has just made a huge, huge difference to the photo. And then of course, if we want to, we can go in and kind of paint in certain areas. So I've just used the adjustment brush here with a little bit of exposure and then just painting that. I've got a little bit of warm tone there as well. And you can really start to kind of highlight the areas you want to actually get to. I mean, look at how much we've done here. I might even bring the exposure down a little bit. It might be getting a little bit too bright. You can also play around, of course, with the tone curve, which we're yet to do a full video on, but we will talk about that as well, which you can use to affect the image as well. If I just turn that on and off, you know, you could actually really help to bring those highlights down, maybe boost the shadows a little bit, or even just bring those down. But there's a lot you can do with these different settings. But I mean, even just what we've done here, and I haven't gone into color, I haven't gone into actually the full edit that I would go into, I've just looked at exposure. We've got the sky that we want to have. We've got the sun over to the right, so I'm not too worried about losing a little bit of sky there, because that is the actual sun. That's always going to be difficult to combat. But look at the difference with these trees and this path and this water. If I just give you another before and after. So this was before and this is after. And that final image is much more akin to what I was looking at when I was actually standing there. And that's ultimately what I wanted to get. I mean, that's a huge difference that we're looking at. I would then obviously go in and change things up with regards to color, maybe add some adjustment brushes and maybe some gradient filters and things like that, and really make the picture come alive. But I mean, it's such a big thing to be able to control the exposure like that, and that's only possible if you expose, in a situation like this, if you expose for the highlights. Now, similarly, I've got this photo of St. Paul's in London, and again, I've exposed for the sky, so because I wanted to keep all the details in the clouds and the sun. It was a very beautiful sunset. But I've left the city and St. Paul's itself in shadow. And of course, if you've seen some other videos where I've used this photo, because I've used this for a few examples, it's a great one for a few examples. I also really like the photo, which helps. It's easy to then bring that back, you know, boost the shadows a bit, bring the sky down, the highlights, so you can get even more detail there. Maybe pop the contrast, pop the clarity a little bit. Maybe bring the exposure up a tad, and then just bring those highlights down. And then of course you can go in and use the adjustment brush to really fill in St. Paul's there and just make it stand out a little bit more. There's all kinds of things. If I do a quick before and after, this was before and this was after. So I've corrected the perspective as well. But you know, you don't want to go too mad, otherwise you're going to have an HDR, a really overly HDR looking image, which no one wants. You know, they look super fake and weird, and I've done it a little bit here. But by exposing for the highlights, again, I'm totally in control of how the image looks, rather than having to figure out a way to kind of negate the fact that part of the sky is blown out or something else isn't working. Maybe end up doing a sky replacement, which I don't particularly want to have to do because the sky is really nice already. So exposing for the highlights just allows you that full control. This really was one of those things that once I learnt it, once I realized that this was how you should do things like this, and I started applying that to landscape photography and cityscape photography and all that kind of stuff, it really changed the end result of my images. And again, shooting in RAW, you just have so much fine control, and that was such a big revelation to me when taking photos like this. Now, if you have any questions about this at all, pop it down in the comments. I'll get back to you ASAP. I'll pop a full list of all the kit that I use for these photos and stuff like that down in the description so you can check that out. Make sure to subscribe for more videos because we've got new stuff all the time. I'll see you in the next video, and as always, thanks for watching.